Good morning. Welcome to the annual New Hampshire Summit on Systemic Inclusion, hosted by the National Collaborative for Digital Equity, which is based in Ware, New Hampshire. And I always want to say a question mark after the location to be appropriate on that. We're going to get this started with, this is going to be 4 days of really exciting, engaged conversation with leaders in educational systems, banking, workforce development, and philanthropy. And helping us kick this off is our own United States Senator Maggie Hassan, whom many of you, of course, will know well as having been governor of New Hampshire and now is U.S. Senator. And she, along with Shaheen, are the only 2 women in U.S. history to have been both governor and U.S. Senator. And so it's really an honor to introduce you, Senator Hassan. Thank you for joining us.
Oh, thanks so much, Bob. I so appreciate being a small part of this summit. And I just want to thank the National Collaborative for Digital Equity for hosting this summit on systemic inclusion. And I want to welcome all of the participants, but I particularly want to highlight how grateful I am that you are doing this right now, because if the pandemic has done anything, it has laid bare the inequities that exist in every sector of our economy and every sector of our society, and really highlighted the barriers to progress that so many Granite Staters and people all across the country face. We know that our communities are stronger when every Granite Stater, every person has an equal opportunity to thrive, right? In our economy, in our schools, in our workforce, in our society. But we know, and we are seeing so clearly right now at this very difficult time, that there are not only digital barriers, and that has been highlighted over the last few months, and there's work going on in Congress to try to address the digital divide in a number of ways, like making sure there's actually internet broadband infrastructure to all parts of our communities. And that there's financial access to broadband and internet, but we know that that's only a piece of the story. And that's why this conference on systemic inclusion is so important, because there are financial and societal barriers that hold people back too, even when they have that kind of digital access. So we need to make sure that we are addressing systemic barriers and divides wherever we find them. And that's why it's so exciting to see so many of you at this summit. I've just been trying to think about the ways that access to these various tools can really be life-changing. And there are so many examples of it. And it's why it's so important that you're focusing on this today. We know how important, just to start with, strengthening financial literacy is to get more families access to the kind of banking services that they need. We know how important it is to close the broadband digital divide to make sure kids can go to school, workers can work remotely, and people can get their health care remotely. We know how important it is that we strengthen our education system, not only to make sure that all of our children receive a quality education, whether it is in person or remotely, but we also know how important it is that our education system think about its task more broadly, develop more pathways to work and to careers, so that we have an educational system that can work for young people and then adults throughout their lifetime, as we deal with the changes in our economy and the changes in technology that will continue to mean that all of us have to become lifelong learners, so that we can adapt and grow and continue to be the kind of workforce that creates and supports an innovative economic sector. So there's a lot of exciting stuff happening that you're going to talk about over the next few days. I want you to know that whether it's in terms of broadband access, education access, workforce training or development, or strengthening the systems overall that help our people find financial security and the freedom that comes with that, the freedom that comes with being able to support yourself, develop self-reliance, strengthen your family, and build a better future for the next generation. Those are all things that all aspects of your summit are going to touch on. And I am really grateful to all of you for your participation. I'm going to continue to work with all of you to support these efforts because I think coming together as Granite Staters and Americans, having experienced the trauma and tragedy that this pandemic has brought, but also finding renewed focus and purpose as we work our way through this pandemic and build back afterwards, it's really going to give us an opportunity to find new and better ways of ensuring that every single Granite Stater and every single American really has that opportunity to thrive. And I'll just close with one of the things I've been reflecting on a lot in the last year or so in particular. When you think about our American purpose and mission, those founding principles that if all of us have individual freedoms and liberties and opportunity, if we are treated as equals, then we can bring out each other's talents and energy and thrive together. That's always been our secret. Every time we've expanded opportunity, brought people in from the margins, we do better. The American purpose is ultimately to bring out the best in each other. And that's really what this summit is about. How can the systems that you all work in really tease out the very best each one of us has to offer? Because when we do that, we are not only successful as a state and country, but we are successful as a world leader. And we demonstrate by example the future that comes with bringing out the best in every single person. So thanks so much, everybody, for your work. I'm really excited to hear about the results of this summit, and I'm honored to be with you this morning. Thanks so much, Bob.
Thank you so much, Senator. It's really a privilege for your kindly joining us. I would like to turn now, another great privilege in my life is to introduce Paul Resta, who is my co-conspirator in all things digital equity and systemic inclusion. And Paul is greeting us from an hour earlier in Texas. He is I'm going to make sure I get this right, the Ruth Knight Milliken Centennial Professor for Learning Technology at the University of Texas, Austin. And Paul has had a wonderful background in technology for learning and for economic and educational opportunity. And Paul was the founding president of the International Society for Technology and Education. But most importantly, in my life, Paul is as kind and talented and patient and thoughtful and persevering as I often am not. So Paul is my grounding and tremendous ally in all this work. And Paul, thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you, Bob. And I'm going to kind of reverse this now by Bob is going to be our keynote speaker. And those of you who have attended our previous summits know, so well the incredible leadership that Bob has provided. Bob is also the co-founder, but he's the executive director of the National Collaborative for Digital Equity. And I really hadn't heard of the Community Reinvestment Act until I met Bob, and this was years ago. And he long ago had the vision that the federal policy makers ought to enable banks and provide them with credit towards meeting their Community Reinvestment Act requirement by making investments in digital equity. And as Bob, has often stated, that low-income families without digital access and skill, the parents can't find, they can't apply for, or qualify for living wage jobs. And as we have seen with the coronavirus, and even before that, that without access to the internet and a device, this is really handicapped low-income students. Bob and I joke about the fact that when we talk to businesses and industries and organizations about the digital divide, they would kind of look at us quizzically like, well, what is that? But with the coronavirus, everyone nationally knows the impact of the digital divide. And one thing that I want to commend both Bob and all of you is that through the past summits and your efforts with Bob's leadership in bringing together the community banks, the schools, the universities, business and industry, state and local government, all of you coming together to work together to achieve the goal of digital equity and systemic inclusion. And, with Bob's leadership and all of your efforts, I mean, this is really exciting. New Hampshire now is the leading state in the nation in terms of showing how, by working collaboratively together, you can close the digital divide. And, Bob has an incredible background. He's been a university college dean. He's been a principal. He's been a teacher. He's led regional efforts for STEM educational reform and policy change. And, it's been an honor and a pleasure and sometimes a challenge to work closely with my colleague, mentor, and dear friend, Dr. Robert McLaughlin, who is now our keynote speaker.
Thank you, Paul, for those very kind remarks. And I knew that you'd have a chance to get me back for whatever I said for you this morning. So we're gonna pivot now because we've got a lot of fun work ahead, Paul and I and you. So let me go to the slideshow and show that for everybody. And then we're gonna get this party started, by gum. So I'm gonna get this to the slideshow mode. Here we go. And we're gonna get this party started. So welcome to you all. Senator Shaheen could not join us this morning, but she asked that remarks very kindly be shared with you, and she kindly provided the following. I applaud the National Collaborative for Digital Equity and Executive Director Bob McLaughlin for organizing the New Hampshire Summit on Systemic Inclusion. This conference will empower Granite State leaders, businesses, educators, and more with the tools and guidance they need to help lift up their communities and break down economic, educational, and technological barriers impacting the local workforce. This summit will be a great opportunity for participants to learn and to listen and learn from one another about how we can level the playing field in our communities to better support New Hampshire's working families, as is especially important as Granite Staters grapple with the economic challenges spurred by the COVID-19 crisis. I hope this event is an engaging and rewarding experience for all. And thank you, Senator Shaheen, for your kind remarks. We want to also thank our sponsors for making the event possible. You'll see that on the Summit webpage. And there are many partners who've contributed, as in years past, in helping get the word out and in framing this conversation so that it is of value to you and your colleagues. and also the many presenters and panelists, facilitators, and other volunteers, including those of us who call ourselves NCDE staff, because truth be told, we're really unpaid. And this is a bit of, I'll own the obsession part and passion for my colleagues on our parts to really do what we can to remove digital divide barriers to economic and educational opportunity. I also want to thank with Sarah Segrist and her partners at Douglas Stewart for putting together a very exciting resource showcase. You'll see on Wednesday and Thursday afternoons, we're piloting the use of a tool called Verbella, which using a browser, you can engage with resource providers in technology for learning and economic inclusion. Otherwise, all of our sessions are in Zoom. And last and absolutely not least, we want to thank you. And so that you know who you are and who your colleagues are in these Zoom conversations, your leaders at the local, state, and in some cases national level in banking, education, philanthropy, and workforce development. And it is not an accident that we've wanted to bring you all together. And we'll come back to that in a moment. Our shared aims are to grow a statewide network of local partnerships to lift low and moderate income, or LMI, learners of all ages out of poverty. And you'll see that that really is the theme that runs throughout all of our conversations and action planning together. And we're really about the process of what we call at NCDE systemic inclusion, which is basically saying that piecemeal approaches to lifting LMI learners out of poverty aren't working. Handing those living in poverty one-legged stools is really not working. We all know this, and we'll dig deep on that over the next 3 days. And so we'll be talking about systemic inclusion as an integrated approach that addresses, the, as Senator Hassan was saying, the financial inclusion and financial literacy needs, the economic inclusion, educational opportunity, and digital inclusion needs of low-income learners. And we're really all about spurring action planning so that this is not your grandma or grandpa's conference, nor is it certainly not during COVID, as we know, because we're Zooming this, and the fact that you all are in this conversation is incredibly kind. Let me just add some more folks into the from the waiting room while we're talking here. Sorry. So we're really looking at spurring more than in a conventional conference, there are awareness raising sessions, and in earlier times, in more pleasant times, you'd have food you'd enjoy and room temperatures you could comment upon. There obviously are no room temperatures and meals to enjoy together, but we certainly are enjoying together ways of really moving from awareness to action and sustained action at that. And the major themes we're looking at addressing are investing for affordable broadband, getting all unbanked families banked, and we'll come back to that in depth when we talk about Bank On and financial inclusion, and we'll really unpack what does that mean and why does it matter. We'll be looking at scaling local after-school partnerships for low and moderate income youth in a partnership that we're very excited to have with Kim Meyer and her colleagues on the board of the New Hampshire After School Network. There's a thriving statewide network of after school programs that are indispensable partners in the mix of this. Then we're also working with Susan Ballard and her colleagues who, more than a dozen past presidents of the American Association of School Librarians, are working together with each other and with us to strengthen the leadership role that school libraries and librarians bring to digital inclusion. And you'll see that there are really crucial contributions that only they can make that are important in all times and are really vitally needed in the COVID era. Over the past several years, our work at NCDE has evolved. We've focused, as many of you know, in years past, we've had for several years running an annual New Hampshire Summit on digital equity. And as Paul was saying, we would often get, for those that did, those who saw the title were going, well, why do I need to go to that? the digital divide doesn't impinge on my work as an educational system leader or philanthropist or banker or economic development or workforce development leader. But now we're seeing that the digital divide can ruin our whole day for just about everybody. But we have changed the frame for our work from digital equity over the years to last year. The New Hampshire Summit was on digital equity and economic inclusion. And in that summit, we broadened that and we made that a 2-day gathering. We focused initially on economic inclusion, which is really making sure that we do more proactively and in sustained systemic ways to strengthen pathways into living wage employment for underemployed and unemployed learners. And now we're talking about systemic inclusion as a really integrated framework for guiding all of this work. And we'll dig deep on that in a moment here. And our North Star has been all along, as Senator Hassan commented, it's about removing digital divide barriers. And as Paul shared as well, we're very much about removing digital divide barriers, but not for its own sake, but because these barriers get in the way of educational and economic opportunity. And it's really difficult to climb out of poverty if you're on the wrong side of the digital divide. And of course, COVID has helped all of us see that that's really the case. At the same time, we're saying if all we do is address the digital divide, well, that's nice, but people are still living in poverty. So that's really not acceptable. And that's why we're emphasizing systemic inclusion. And as Paul mentioned, the Community Reinvestment Act, or CRA, is not a cure-all and end-all and be-all in the challenges we face together, but it is a potentially incredibly powerful engine for systemic inclusion and for lifting LMI learners of all ages out of poverty. And we're really committed to working together with the New Hampshire Bankers Association, the Municipal Association, the State Departments of Education and Business and Economic Affairs, and a variety of other partners, Economic Vitality New Hampshire, and so on lifting folks out of poverty, tapping CRA, philanthropic, and educational system resources. So you'll see quite a bit about CRA as a crucial thread woven up throughout where we hope to go together in action planning. In the pandemic era, there's a profound need to move from CRA compliance to CRA impact. It's important to understand briefly about the CRA statute. This is a statute, the Community Reinvestment Act was passed by Congress in 1977, and it requires that banks that are FDIC insured, which is most banks, that they have to make investments for economic opportunity in low and moderate income areas in that bank service region. And this is a condition for their maintaining eligibility for depositor insurance. And very much like for educators, you'll appreciate this analogy. For colleges in particular, colleges have to be accredited in order to maintain eligibility for their students for federal financial aid. And if they aren't reaccredited, they lose that eligibility and it's pretty much game over. It's very much that way for banks. If they get an unsatisfactory rating on their CRA compliance review, which they get every 3 to 4 years at least, if not more frequently, if they do not get a satisfactory or better rating on their CRA compliance review, they risk losing depositor insurance, which is game over for them. So that said, banks have spent, since the statute was passed, roughly $3 trillion on economic opportunity in high poverty communities, low and moderate income communities in the bank service region. That figure has grown because it's pegged as a percentage of, in many cases, as a percentage of a bank's assets. And as assets grow over time, banks are now spending just a hair. If you look at $20 billion being a hair, and I like to round up, if you round up by a mere $20 billion, banks are spending $500 billion a year on CRA compliance for economic opportunity. And in ordinary times, this is, it's not great, but it's certainly understandable that banks are spending these dollars for compliance because that's job one for banks. But in a COVID era, where we are all about to experience a much harsher economy than we already do. We're going to see, as I think virtually all of us know and are concerned about, we're about to see a massive wave of foreclosures and evictions. And homelessness is going to become a reality for many millions more Americans than we've ever seen before. We're going to see an economic devastation that rivals, I believe, what European cities faced at the end of World War II, when they looked around at their cities in rubble and they had to rebuild. And we are now at the cusp of that kind of the need to rebuild and be very intentional about this and very strategic. And CRA represents an amazing opportunity, that ecosystem, working with banking leaders collaboratively to build systemic inclusion in investments that move LMI families and communities out of poverty. We can move from compliance to impact. We have an opportunity and a compelling need to really do that. Towards that end, you're going to see, so that's a thread we're going to be talking about throughout the next three days of the summit. The final session on Friday morning, where I wanted to draw your attention to this, we're going to be focusing on the need to harvest and do a much better job of harvesting promising and proven CRA-funded practices in this $500 billion a year ecosystem. We've got self-reporting formats that the regulatory agencies, the FDIC, Federal Reserve, and the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency at Treasury use, and that for banks to self-assess and then for examiners to come in and externally assess. And these reporting formats do not make it easy. I mean, without a really unworkable amount of labor intensiveness. They make it very difficult to harvest promising and proven CRA-funded practices that really look like they're very innovative and or impactful. And one of the things that we're going to be challenging the CRA ecosystem, which is not only banking leaders, but also their partners in affordable housing, financial literacy, financial inclusion, economic inclusion, and now digital inclusion and educational inclusion. We're really saying we need to work together to do it, to systematically grow an empirical knowledge base so that bankers can more easily share with one another their promising and proven practices, and that we can then drive a more impactful CRA ecosystem writ large. And that has really not happened yet. And if you do a literature search in EBSCO databases, for example, and what do we know around empirical knowledge base on CRA investments for efficacy, there's just about no research on that. And that really needs to change, because if we're going to climb ourselves out of the pandemic crisis that we're in, CRA has a crucial role to play, and so does knowledge generation to support that, moving from compliance to impact. That said, let's briefly talk about the economic inclusion, the systemic inclusion framework that we've developed, and we're finding this seems to resonate, but we'll find out over the next 3 days if we're just imagining that, or if you agree that this really resonates for you. So if you think of the acronym FEED, F-E-E-D, you'll see that we're talking about 4 dimensions, and we don't think of these as the only dimensions that matter in lifting LMI learners out of poverty, but we know that these are all CRA compliant, potentially, investments to help lift LMI learners out of poverty. And our position on this is that if we don't address all 4 legs of this stool, that we're gonna be greatly impeded in the impactfulness of our efforts. Financial inclusion has to do with, are we getting unbanked and underbanked families banked? So one of the things you're going to hear more about in the panel later today and tomorrow on Bank On is that according to FDIC's wonderful, very powerful research on unbanked and underbanked families, 43% of African-American families and over 50% of Latinx families in the US don't have a checking account. these unbanked, if you will, families spend between 2.5% and 10% of their income on check cashing fees. So families that live in poverty, as James Baldwin can tell us, the famous author, he wrote that those who have grown up in poverty know it's extremely expensive to be poor. And this is a perfect, painful example of that, that families that grow up in poverty that aren't banked are spending resources they can ill afford to divert away from food and housing and clothing and diapers for their kids, essentials for their kids' learning. They're diverting that to check cashing fees. And what we find in a lot of high poverty communities is that check cashing companies and petty lenders are sitting like vultures on a fence post, waiting to prey on low-income families. And financial inclusion has to do with spurring, and thanks to the Cities for Financial Empowerment Fund, which we'll hear from today and later this week from David Rothstein and from Michael Endelman with Bank on Boston and Jeff Manning with FDIC Boston. These are all amazing experts on this notion of bank on, which is getting unbanked and underbanked families banked with free checking, free financial literacy, and so on. And it really addresses in very compelling ways the concerns that Senator Hassan led off with in terms of financial inclusion and literacy. So that's one dimension. So that's nice. We get unbanked families banked. That's nice. Wouldn't it be nicer if we actually made more coherent, integrated efforts to also ensure that families that live in poverty have living wages so they have money to put in those accounts and be financially literate about that? And that's what economic inclusion is about, the first E in feed. And this has to do with what are we doing for these same underbanked and unbanked families, not only getting them financially included and financially literate, providing support for that, but are we helping them through very thoughtfully designed local and high poverty communities, locally appropriate inclusive pathways into in-demand living wage jobs in that labor market that are appropriate for that community. And even under COVID, as I think we all know, in this summit community that we're all participating in this week, as we all know, there are a lot of good paying jobs in manufacturing, in banking, in teaching, in STEM, in environmental sustainability, in high tech, and so on, construction. There are healthcare. There are many, many fields in which good jobs are not going filled. And so one of the things that we're looking at is how can we make sure that this second leg of the stool is also part of the mix in high poverty communities. The third leg is also not trivial. Wouldn't it be nice if LMI learners had opportunities for sustained learning to develop the skills and dispositions they need to fill those in-demand living wage jobs, A, and B, to equip them with the skills and dispositions as a self-confident lifelong learner? Because it's one thing to prepare somebody for today's living wage job, and that's a not trivial thing we'll all appreciate, but we also know that careers, entire market segments with technology and economic turbulence come and go. And it's really incumbent upon all of us to do as much as we can to equip learners with the skills to become lifelong learners so that we can adapt and change and learn and anticipate new career opportunities that open up. So this is really a lifelong challenge, and that needs to be part of the mix. And so that's the second E in feed in our systemic inclusion framework. And then lastly, which is where we started, which is digital inclusion, or what we refer to as systemic digital equity, and that's really where Paul and I began 3 or 4 years ago, when we, to our astonishment, we managed to persuade policymakers in the CRA ecosystem through, actually, ironically, an unsuccessful pilot effort that we launched with the mayor of San Antonio and the San Antonio school system and the city council and economic developers. We were looking to have San Antonio, working with the mayor's leadership, to become the first city to mobilize bank CRA investments, the first city in the country, we hope, from 2013 to 2015, we were hoping that we could mobilize bankers to remove digital divide barriers to financial, economic, and educational inclusion. And our basic premise was and is very simple, which is that without digital access and skill, as Paul was saying, it's really, it even 7 to 8 years ago already become impossible to find out about living wage jobs, apply for them, prepare, and qualify for them if you did not have digital access and skill. If you're on the wrong side of the digital divide, it's hard to even find out about, let alone apply for non-living wage jobs, and let alone living wage jobs. And the pilot, we were all ready to go in the spring of 2015 when the mayor's office, which was the linchpin in all of this pilot effort in San Antonio, went radio silent, to our complete bafflement and dismay. And it turns out that the mayor of San Antonio was offered and of course took the job as secretary at HUD, Julian Castro. And so he took a wonderful opportunity to move to a national leadership stage, but that left us going, wait, no, don't go, come back. And so we were very crestfallen about that. Right when we're ready to launch a conversation with the city's banking leadership to become the first city to remove digital divide barriers. But the Federal Reserve System, particularly their Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas and their San Antonio office, took that message all the way to the Federal Reserve System. And they came back the end of that summer of 2015 and said, we don't need a pilot. We're convinced, we agree that banks ought to have the option, if they so desire, to get CRA credit for removing digital divide barriers to economic opportunity, because we are in an increasingly digitally based economy, and we've got to address the digital divide where those barriers get in the way. And so we knew that they were going to be issuing a publication in 2016. So Paul and I pivoted, formed the National Collaborative for Digital Equity, and said, we need to educate banking leaders, and this is where systemic digital equity comes in. We knew, having been in technology in education, in schools, K-12, and in teacher education, we had known for years that there are lots of creative ways that we as educational leaders had been very ineffective with using learning technology dollars, for very well-intentioned but unsuccessful efforts like put a computer lab in every school, or give every kid a device, or simply offer broadband and learning will magically happen. And what we realized is it's not so, it ain't that simple, and that you've got to look at not only equitable access at school and home to broadband and devices, but less obvious, but equally essential food groups in systemic digital equity, equitable access to tech support, librarian support, which is one of the things we're going to emphasize with a whole action planning strand on Thursday that we're very excited about. That's really crucial for media literacy and digital literacy and cyber safety and anticipating and to the extent possible, preventing the harm from device and social network addiction as you do make gains in digital access and inclusion. So there's a potential downside to that, and we need to be thoughtful about that. So we've learned in education that to be impactful, there has to be a systemic approach to that. And we realize there's no reason to expect banking leaders and other investors, like in foundations, philanthropic leaders, to make systemic investments. So that's why we formed the National Collaborative for Digital Equity. But always, again, with an eye to, okay, let's support systemic approach to digital equity, but in support of these other dimensions of inclusion. And pretty soon I will pause and take a breath, and we're gonna, I promise you, and we will pivot to Q&A and chat. I promise. So we're getting close now. So so this said, but I want to get to the good stuff, which is your insights, your questions, your concerns. And plus, this is me on decaf. This is my slow setting. So it's so there's really I'd be hurrying if I didn't have an external reason. So as we know, since 1977, banks have spent $3 trillion for economic opportunity, in low and moderate income or LMI communities to meet their federal CRA requirement, which is a vast sum. And at the same time, foundations and educational systems have, over that same 4.5 decades, have spent many billions on educational opportunity. But the reality, we believe, is that neither has been terribly impactful. Largely, CRA spending has been, there's a lot of, it's hard to overstate this, probably impossible to overstate how much wonderful intention and brilliance and impact has been happening in largely those siloed, discrete ways that banks are investing in financial literacy here and affordable housing there, and addressing transportation here and financial literacy there. And these are all really important investments. They are compliant. Many banks, the vast majority of banks, are meeting their CRA requirement, and some are doing so. And you'll hear from several of them today, tomorrow, and the rest of this week, that are achieving outstanding ratings, which is not easy to achieve on their bank CRA compliance reviews. There's a lot of really good stuff happening. But the problem is, in the aggregate, if we look as a society at evisceration of the middle class, at the resegregation of neighborhoods and housing and schools, if we're looking at continued insufficiently equitable access to capital and credit for entrepreneurs of color, and so on, those metrics have not seen substantial gains. And this is, as an ecosystem, we're saying that's really not okay. One of the big flaws, I believe, and I'll own this perception, and in talking with friends in banking, I think there's some resonance here, but I know you're going to tell me if this is hooey, and I invite you to do so, because it's by that honest engagement that we can get to a better understanding of what needs to happen. But I believe that one of the big unexamined presumptions of the CRA ecosystem, of the vast majority of CRA investments for economic opportunity, are on the implicit presumption that kids who grow up in intergenerational poverty will survive sufficiently intact and in sufficient numbers to take advantage of the wonderful economic opportunities that CRA is making available largely for LMI adults. But the problem is that, and I can tell you this, and so can Paul, and the many educators among us today, we can tell you that one of the things that happens to kids who grow up in poverty, particularly intergenerational poverty, which means that their social capital is below the floor in terms of access to role models who've been to college often, who neighbors and parents and grandparents and others who can say to them, you've got economic opportunity, the world is your oyster, persist, it's going to be worth your while. One of the things that happens shockingly young for those who have not experienced this themselves as an educator or themselves having grown up in poverty is that it's often a very reasonable conclusion for kids as young as 2nd or 3rd grade that you got nothing for me. I've got a lifetime of poverty ahead of me, and I'm grateful as a kid that I can come to school and enjoy my friends, or enjoy the arts or sports, or a teacher who cares about me, or a coach who cares about me. And thank God you do. But really, academically, what's the point in persisting? And so, I mean, the school to prison pipeline is not just a phrase, it's a reality for lots of reasons. And it's because the investments we're making on economic opportunity start too late in life is one of the pieces. Meanwhile, you've got foundations and educational systems that have been investing bazillions of dollars for educational opportunity. And most of those investments are also well-intentioned, brilliant, thoughtful, caring, impactful as far as they go. But at the same time, if you look in the aggregate, excuse me, over the past 4.5 decades, you see that some of the same problems persist that we saw 4 decades ago. School to prison pipeline, trauma sensitive classroom practices, disproportionality of kids of color in referral to discipline and special ed, the graduation rates, the achievement gaps. These things have really not appreciably improved over the past 4 decades. And I don't mean any of this to accuse anyone of us. I think we have to look at ourselves as an ecosystem, and there's power in that, and saying we need to rethink how we work together. So a lot of what's happened in philanthropy and in educational systems at the K-12 and post-secondary level is we've invested in addressing the consequences of poverty, but not the root cause of poverty itself. And often because it's not within the mission and the funding scope of foundations and how they were chartered in school systems and community colleges and tribal colleges and four-year colleges and so on. A lot of what we're supposed to be doing is addressing educational opportunity, so it's reasonable. But the problem is that these efforts to address, for example, the school to prison pipeline, we may make progress for a time under grant funding with infusion of resources, but as those infusions time out, we find a reversion to the past metrics in far too many communities. We're not seeing enough sustained impact in the aggregate. So what we're saying is, therefore, that neither of these investments for economic and educational opportunity really have been moving the dials. This is not a news flash for any of us. We know this. Let me just take a quick sidebar to say that in 1990, Mark Tucker authored a brilliant report by the National Center on Education and the Economy called America's Choice, High Skills or Low Wages. And he really called it was very prescient. And we're at a very similar moment in time now. He said back in 1990 that we already saw other nations investing proactively and strategically in becoming high skill, high wage economies. And he said, Mark Tucker and his colleagues at the National Center for Education and the Economy said in this brilliant report, we've got to be proactive. And if we're not making those conscious, strategic, sustained investments for a high skills, high wage economy, we will by default end up with the low skill, low wage economy that we now have. And with COVID, that low skill, low wage economy is about to become the dominant black hole in our economic universe in the US. We've got to address it, and we haven't stated positively. We have another moment in time where we can be strategic and thoughtful and build consciously a high skill, high wage economy by integrating these investments. And that's really what we're calling for here. So what you're going to see, and I'm going to fast forward so we can allow for some time for chat and comment here, because I want to make sure. Oh, good. I see one comment saying, so good to hear that we're speaking of social capital. Yes, we really do believe that that's really mission critical, that it's not just financial capital that kids growing up in poverty need. They need social capital, but there are ways that we can help them address that. And that's actually a good segue to this slide that you see now, that what we're saying here, for example, the Manchester Partnership, you're going to hear today, working with wonderful allies at Manchester Proud and leaders of a dozen banks with operations in Manchester, the president of Manchester Community College, the leadership of Southern New Hampshire University, the New Hampshire Bankers Association, and other partners. We've begun an extraordinary effort to develop a long-term strategy for joint investment for systemic inclusion, starting incrementally with baby steps and low-hanging fruit. I don't want to steal that group's amazing thunder, so that you're going to hear later this morning from that group what they're doing. It's really exciting and very inspiring, and it is a wonderful example of what we mean concretely by working together collaboratively for win-win-win uses of CRA dollars for compliance and impact, and working with educational systems and workforce development leaders and philanthropic leaders to say, let's move together to lift LMI families out of poverty. And we know it's going to be a long haul. It's not an easy fix, but we're going to go at it hammer and tong, and we're going to do it together, by golly, until we see those dials move and we lift these kids and their families out of poverty. Similarly, you're going to learn about the Vista partnership, and you're going to hear about that tomorrow. And this is a partnership that's being supported by Bangor Savings Bank, which is working with 13 LMI youth in an after-school program in Manchester that's providing financial inclusion and literacy, economic and educational inclusion, and digital inclusion supports. So we're really modeling in a microcosm. What do we mean by that? You're going to learn about Operation Lemonade, which is about taking COVID and the horror show that is the digital divide now under COVID, and saying, let's make something good out of that, which is the awareness of the digital divide. Let's spur sustained investment for broadband. And Carol Miller and dear friends, along with Carol, with the New Hampshire School Connectivity Initiative, are going to be leading a lovely panel tomorrow afternoon, and then an action planning strand on Thursday about how do we mobilize CRA and other foundation and other support for affordable access to broadband and building out fiber for permanently, sustainably, affordably priced broadband in underserved areas of the state. So you're going to hear about that. You're also going to hear, as I mentioned earlier, about the crucial role of libraries and librarians in all this. You're going to learn about the wonderful and crucial role that they bring to all this. You're also going to hear about Bank On and Bank On New Hampshire, which is somewhere between prenatal and neonatal. It's being born as we speak, in collaboration with Bank On Boston and Connecticut, who've been tremendously kindly mentoring us. You're going to hear from Janelle Leonard, who's helping us lead that charge here in New Hampshire, along with David Rothstein at Cities for Financial Empowerment Fund, and Jeff Manning and his colleagues at FDIC New England out of the Boston office. And that's a really inspiring effort with banks in New Hampshire that want to offer these free accounts and free financial literacy. And several banks are already stepping up. And you're going to hear, not least, you're going to see on your summit agenda, you're going to see some great links. You're going to see on your agenda on Wednesday afternoon at 4 and Thursday afternoon at 4, another tool called Verbella, which is going to be a web-based way for you to interact with resource providers. And we're going to offer, together with our partners, pointers for you to great allies that can help you move the dial on these issues that we're raising together. And one of the things that we have always done at NCDE in our diabolical plan to try to move the agenda and move for action and impact is saying it's one thing to exhort and offer, we hope a nice conceptual framework for this work, but it's really much more important that we help you connect with each other and with allies that can help you with the resources you need to get this work happening in your community in ways that make sense to you locally. So coming soon, lastly, we've got, in fact, it's already live. It's neonatal, but it's alive. And we're going to send you, by the way, I'm going to email all our summit registrants a copy of the slideshow. These links are on there. So you'll see these links. I'm not going to take you to them now because I want to make sure we allow at least a couple seconds here for chat and comment. But Ask a Librarian, this is an extraordinary effort with Susan Ballard and her colleagues who are nearly 15 past presidents of the American Association of School Librarians, who are an amazing group of folks who are very humbly offering a free service for school librarians called Ask a Librarian, saying, are you stressed? Do you need help better serving students, their teachers and families in the COVID era? And you'll see a link to where you can post a question and get amazing responses from folks who either, if they don't know the answer, being librarians, odds are pretty good they can know where to help you turn. We've also just come out with the Educator's Guide to Digital Equity Resources for Systemic Inclusion, which Comcast Internet Essentials has sponsored. and generously made possible. We're about to disseminate that towards the end of this week. We're going to get this out to about 3 million educators nationwide as a free PDF. And you'll see the link about how to download this. We have the excerpt available right now, but the full version is going to go live roughly in the next 24 hours on our website. And we're pretty excited about that. It points educators and parents, by the way, to free and low-cost providers of broadband devices, tech support, librarian support, content apps, and so on. And then, of course, we have the Bank on New Hampshire Coalition now being launched. We also have, thanks to many of you on this call yourself, are members of this. We have a New Hampshire Council on Systemic Inclusion. And this group too is neonatal, but this group is going to provide a clearinghouse for a growing network of communities like Manchester and Franklin that have begun their own approaches to systemic inclusion. And we hope to support efforts in other communities to learn from each other, to share what they're inventing with one another, and to tap resources that from banking leaders and philanthropic and education system leaders at the state level. And so that's that we're the first state in the country to have a statewide council on systemic inclusion. Coming soon, we're going to have a database of digital equity resources that you can search. That's going to start with the resources in our educator's guide, but it's going to open up to a global community of experts in digital equity resources and become more and more robust. You're going to see that on our website on the resources tab. And then what we're hoping, finally, if the conversation goes well, on Friday, our concluding summit panel on how can we better harvest promising and proven CRA practices. We hope to, with banking colleagues, build a database that makes it easier for bankers and their partners to find out about really cool things that you're all already doing. So that said, we're trying to stir things up, and we've got just a few moments for chat, and just want to open it up. And if you want to unmute yourself and either make a comment in the chat or just open up your audio if you have a comment or a question to share, and then we're going to wrap up in another 3 minutes. And I apologize for covering this all so quickly. Thanks for your sense of humor and persistence in joining us. Okay. We'll give us another moment of wait time, and then we're going to exhibit good Zoom behavior and not keep you a moment longer than is absolutely necessary. So with that, with no comments at this point, a lot to absorb. We're going to pause the recording of this. We're going to make the recording link for this and all the other sessions available to Summit registrants. And so you'll be getting a copy of this. Thank you for joining us. And we look forward to you joining us at other sessions of great interest to yourself. And here's hoping you have a safe morning. Thanks so much, everybody.
Thank you, Robert.